Lauren and Christian, welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. You work for Siemens Energy, and there are a number of companies with Siemens in the name. Can you explain the structure of it?
Yes, absolutely, and so welcome, and thank you for the invitation. So indeed, Siemens AG is a company that's existed for a long time, for over 175 years. And it's a conglomerate with a whole variety of different businesses. So I currently work for Siemens Energy, which is a spin-off that was spun off from the Siemens AG business back in 2019, 2020. And then there is also a Siemens Mobility business, which is still part of Siemens AG, which is all the trains. And then you've also got a separately listed Siemens entity, which is Siemens Healthineers, which is the former medical devices business. So there are various different parts, but the part that I can speak to is Siemens Energy, which is the energy part of the Siemens AG business, which was spun off a couple of years ago.
And can you please then explain to us the key sectors where Siemens Energy is active, and maybe trying to project some similarities with digital markets, what we can learn from it?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I always explain to people when it comes to Siemens Energy is that we are an energy technology company. And so we are not an energy company. We are not responsible for providing electricity to our customers, for example. So we are slightly upstream from that. And so our customers would be the energy generators that would then sell the electricity onto the customer. So I think that distinction is quite important. So we have four business areas. So we have gas services, which is the main component of that, is the gas turbines business, and that's probably the area of the business which is most well known to, let's say, normal people. If people think of Siemens, they'd be thinking of gas turbines usually, and so that's within our gas services business. Then we have grid technologies, which currently is very important, given the need within Europe to, and indeed other parts of the world, to improve and strengthen the grid. And we've seen also just recently in Spain and Portugal what happens when that doesn't work very well. Then we have a business area which is known as transformation of industries. That is a collection of various different businesses, including hydrogen, for example, steam turbines, compression, that kind of stuff. And then we also have Siemens Gamesa, which again, quite a few people may have heard of, given that they were not quite as successful as we would have liked. But that's the wind turbine business. And so those are the four business areas that we have. And maybe in terms of a few facts and figures as to kind of how big the business is. So in financial year 2024, we had a revenue of about 35 billion euros, half of which in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, about a third in the Americas, and then the rest in APAC. Siemens Energy is active in over 90 countries, so we are a worldwide operator. We have orders of around 50 billion euros and an order backlog of 123 billion. So, we will keep busy for the foreseeable future. We do that with over 100,000 employees. And indeed, one of the things that I kind of like most, and one of the most quoted statistics about us, is that we are responsible for about 1/6 of the global electricity generation, which is based on our technology. And that then also, of course, means that we have very high R&D investments, over 1 billion euros kind of every year. When it comes to, let's say, what you said in your question about the comparison to digital markets, I think we would certainly consider that all of the market segments in which we are active are heavily contested and competitive. And I think in contrast to digital markets, you can have, let's say, widely varying market shares depending on how successful you are in the market. So it's less the kind of tipping markets that we've seen in the digital space. I mean, just because you've won a major gas turbine order doesn't mean that you're going to win the next one. In fact, that's I would say less certain rather than more certain. So I think these are not necessarily kind of winner-take-all markets in the way that we've seen kind of in digital. Nevertheless, of course, we continue to compete as hard as we can against the key competitors that we have in all of our segments. So that's certainly what I work on a daily basis with our business colleagues.
But for such technological heavyweight giant, actually, I would be interested to understand how do you position yourself? Do you consider yourself a European company, either as a kind of antagonistic self-perception of being simultaneously Europe-centered and global, where how do you adjust to different markets? And do you expect to be somehow reflecting quasi-public kind of duties in response to this growing awareness of Europe's need to engage in becoming more competitive globally?
Mm. So I think, of course, given that we're a German headquartered company, we would generally consider ourselves to be a German and therefore a European company. I mean, I think that's clear. However, as I said earlier, I mean, we have very significant activities, kind of both in the Americas and in Asia Pacific. So, it would be very unfair to all of those colleagues and to the lots of business that we do. Also, if I look at the Middle East, for example, or countries like China. They are all very important for us, and so I think you can be a German or a European company and still have very significant activities and still be also considered to be a local company in various other places. I mean, we have major manufacturing facilities in the US, for example, and in other parts of the world. So yes, we are a European company, and that is of course an important issue. I mean, in terms of what we've been seeing, kind of recently, I think, we consider ourselves to be kind of international. We want to make sure that we are properly capable of being active in all parts of the world. We refer to ourselves as a global leader in energy technology. So, that's something that we take very seriously. We want to help kind of our customers to make sure that we can reduce emissions and increase energy supply. So that's kind of the balance that we have to find. And we have activities across kind of the entire, let's say, the entire value chain, kind of within energy. In fact, we're one of the very few, if not the only, kind of company that has that kind of end-to-end kind of portfolio. And so ultimately, wherever we are active, kind of in the world, we want to help our customers to reduce their emissions, to make energy affordable, and that's kind of our broad kind of strategic vision that we have. And I think I mean, we just published our figures this morning. I saw some press reports to say that apparently management is of the view that that the tariffs and other issues aren't going to affect us too badly because we are set up in various different parts of the world. So I think that's the way that we would broadly think about those kinds of topics.
Yeah, so let me ask you, Gordon, to help to explain and visualize the self-evident things. Everything is getting digital. The role of data is increasing pretty much exponentially. AI, high. You not only hear the things, you operate with the things on daily basis, so you know it from the inside. Can you please visualize to us how quick the development is, how important these elements of this change are, and what should we expect?
Yeah. So I think the whole kind of big data and AI topic is obviously being talked about, kind of a lot. Probably a few years ago, very few people would have heard of NVIDIA yet. These days everyone knows, kind of who they are and what they do. I mean, I think we've seen in the energy space that the specter of kind of data centers coming online because the AI systems are very power hungry, that supports our business, because we provide technology for the running of those data centers. And so, when it turned out that, for example, the big AI project that was launched in the US, by the new administration, that led to a positive development in our share price because investors thought, look, this is something that will also benefit Siemens Energy. So I think that's certainly something that is important. I mean, we have a sensible big chunk of our business which we do on the digital side of things. So there is a business element, but of course there is also the element of AI being used now increasingly in business processes. We have a large project going on the IT side, introducing co-pilots to people. So for example, I have a co-pilot license and use that. So kind of AI and big data is basically everywhere. Big data is also an important input for some of our service offerings. So I think you have to see it both on the business side and then also on the employees using AI to be more efficient, to take care of the basic tasks, etc. And I think, of course, also the question that then arises is, what's the right way of regulating? And so I think the EU has taken the approach that they want to maybe regulate first and then kind of guide the development in a certain direction, whereas I think with our friends across the pond in the West, they would see it somewhat differently. They would probably say, look, we need to develop first, and then we'll see, if there are any excesses that we have to regulate. So I think we see, for a globally operating company, that's of course not easy because you have major blocks taking very different views on how such topics should be regulated. I mean, for me personally, I'm of the view that AI requires some kind of sensible regulation. I think that's not controversial, but I think people can disagree as to what exactly that means. I just become quite nervous when you hear experts in AI basically openly admitting in public that they also don't really know how their systems work at a technical level. And I think in that type of situation, then you do have to give some thought to regulating so that the development goes in the right way and is a benefit to humanity. I mean, I don't subscribe to any of the apocalyptic scenarios, but I do think that there are certainly aspects of AI which would be worrying, and I think those are topics that then have to be dealt with by regulation.
But again, speaking of your global presence and thus the ability to keep to monitor the response of the industry and Siemens Energy in particular to different regulatory tonalities, different regulatory moods and initiatives, I'm not necessarily asking you to explain which model works better, but do you sense there is an internal consensus as to which model works and which regulatory approach is kind of less efficient or maybe completely ineffective? Does the business understand the energy coming from the regulators, and where do you have the answers well before we get these answers in the general media and in the common knowledge?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult balancing act. I mean, I think for any business representative will tell you that what is important is that there are kind of clear rules that don't kind of impede progress, but that provide kind of guardrails. I mean, we've seen that also. I mean, these days, any social media executive would tell you the same thing. They are not against regulation as such, but they want to know what are the rules of the road, and they want to make sure that they can still continue to increase to develop their products. And I think whatever regulation you choose, I mean, I guess as I'm a European kind of citizen, I would basically subscribe to the fact that, and I certainly see that with AI, that we should be regulating as things develop. Of course, the downside to that is that you are regulating in somewhat of a vacuum because you can't know exactly in which way the developments are going to go. And of course, on the AI side in particular, developments are going tremendously fast. But I think it would be counterproductive, and I think most businesses would consider it to be counterproductive to say, okay, we'll let AI kind of go ahead without any regulation for the next 3 years, and then we'll see where we are. I think that's not really a realistic scenario.
Do you know of a jurisdiction which appears to strike this balance right, which is simultaneously mindful of its macroeconomic interests, technological interests, and yet simultaneously allows sufficient room and oxygen for the companies to develop fast? And so, who strike this balance right? Or it's again it's very context dependent, and the answer can change very quickly.
Yeah, I think it's the latter really. I mean, I mean certainly the European Union is being criticized for the fact that the AI Act, in the view of many, is regulating before or is regulating and therefore impeding development of something that that is not necessary. I mean, as I think I said. I'm clearly of the view that the potential downsides of AI are such that I would prefer to have the building blocks of regulation already in place so that we all agree on final outcome or on the guardrails. So for me personally, the EU is a good model here, and I think the differences of opinion are really about. The speed, the clarity versus to what extent does it impede development. And I think depending on whether you are let's say an AI developer who would like to have basically no guardrails and just blue sky to do what they want, that person is going to have a very different view from maybe me as a consumer who says, look, I don't like the idea of I don't know, my medical data being looked at by AI rather than a doctor, just to give you a basic example. So for me personally, I think the EU has done pretty well on the AI regulation side of things so far. But of course, the major, apart from maybe one or two companies, the major AI players are not in Europe. So it's a tricky issue.
We say Siemens Energy, and we immediately imply Siemens. We say Siemens, we know that the immediate connotation is Siemens Alstom. We say Siemens Alstom, it leads us to merger control policy question. So what are your views on the current state of affair in the European Union?
So I think on the merge control side, it's been a pretty interesting kind of last few years. I mean, I was within the competition team at Siemens when we did the Siemens Energy, sorry, the Siemens Alstom transaction. I think it was very interesting. It was a very interesting time. I think that fundamentally. It was right to point out that the assessment of a merger should take into account potential competition from other parts of the world. And I think there was simply a disagreement as to how likely and how quickly that entry might happen. But also, if you look now on the energy side of things, I mean, we see very strategic moves by Chinese players entering into the European market. And so, I think the idea that merge control should take those kinds of topics into account, is clearly correct. Now, the merger was prohibited, as of course you and most of the viewers will know. But I think we've seen quite a step change in Europe. And I mean, just to quote kind of Teresa Ribera, the competition commissioner, in a speech just 10 days ago, and maybe I can just read this because I think it really is interesting, just to show how far the European Commission has come. She says in her speech, "We want European champions, and in fact we have many, but we don't let players concentrate at any cost, nor at the expense of competitive markets or consumers. We support mergers that enhance Europe's global position and truly contribute to innovation, technological progress, and do not undermine competition." Now, I think most businesses would, support that kind of assessment, and I think what we have seen is that also through reports like the Draghi report, for example, that Europe, needs to make sure that it is able to, continue to exist in the, in the big race between the various different trading blocks that we have in the world, and that we can't just focus um, on Europe as such, but that we have to look at how is our competitiveness on the global scale. And so I think topics that maybe 5 years ago during the Siemens Alstom time were still looked at very differently, now might have a different treatment. So I mean, I think the Siemens Alstom case kind of kicked off a discussion that and some people would say led to the European Commission deciding that they wanted to come up with something like the foreign subsidies regulation, because clearly the foreign subsidies regulation is targeted at trying to make sure that we have this level playing field in Europe. I think any business would say, yes, we need a level playing field in Europe. But so ultimately, I think the Siemens Alstom case has now led a number of years down the line with, after a number of different crises, to maybe, the European Commission coming to a view that, yes, actually this whole interaction between competition policy and industrial policy, is an important topic for resilience. And, we do need to take into account competitive pressures from outside of the EU if there is appropriate evidence to suggest that. And so who knows how that case may have been decided if it had come up now as opposed to back in 2019. But look, at the end of the day, I think this whole Siemens Alstom topic has led to some kind of rethinking by policymakers, and I think that's not necessarily a bad thing.
I will have separate questions, Gordon, about foreign subsidies regulation,
Yep.
about connections, possible links between competition and industrial policy. But I wanted to pause here and to ask you a follow-up, one kind of tactical and another more strategic one. The tactical one is that many people say, well, if not European Union, the merger would be blocked by other major jurisdiction. So how likely it would be? Obviously, talking about hypotheticals is like historians know how naive that it is, but just to reflect upon this. And more strategic one, what have we missed? What was the opportunity? Which measurable, tangible outcomes the merger between two giants would bring, and how significant your role is and would be in this global market?
So I think obviously whenever a company kind of our size, or indeed any company, enters into that kind of transaction, there is a clear kind of strategic rationale. You are putting together, kind of two companies that hopefully, together will be able to, provide better products and services to customers, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there is in a sense no great magic to these situations, and of course you can also imagine that these deals are not undertaken lightly. So kind of months and sometimes years of planning goes into considering, does this all make sense? Do we get the synergies that we want, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think the mobility business, you see, if you look at kind of how the major projects are undertaken within mobility, they are often undertaken by consortium, because the individual players, even though they are big in their own right, they are still, with some of these mega projects that we've seen in mobility, they are simply not big enough. They don't have enough capacity. And so, an enlarged business, hopefully would have been able to, deal with those kinds of projects maybe better than you could do, separately. But at the end of the day, this is all speculation, because the deal kind of didn't ultimately go ahead. But I think it would not have been undertaken if there had been kind of the feeling that this would have been, extraordinarily difficult from a competition law, kind of point of view. I mean, I think there was and I think there still is a genuinely held belief that there are competitive constraints from other parts of the world, in particular Asia. I say again that we have seen kind of Chinese companies strategically enter Europe due to overcapacities in the local market, and so of course when you are looking at that, one way in which you might address that kind of market entry is that you bulk up, you become bigger, and I think that's a natural reaction. And so, I think that's very much the background to these kinds of cases. It's always about, can we serve our customers better? Are we, bringing together complementary strengths? Maybe also regional complementarity. I mean, that was the case in other energy deals that I've worked on, for example, that we had nice complementarity between what the target did and what we did, which then also from a competition perspective is less problematic. So I think those are the kind of thoughts that go into transactions like that.
You noted that the mood in the European Commission has always been changing, evolving. Would you think that there is still an interest between these two companies to reconsider this, reopen another chapter, a second chapter of possible merger, A, and B, Asia? How rapidly do your competitors evolve and scale, and how do you see the opportunities for European players to match this global development? Because it's not only about European markets or Asian markets. I imagine, it's also about being present and shaping technological leadership globally.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, on the chances of a deal like that coming back, I honestly have no idea. I've been away from Siemens AG for 5 years now, so I wouldn't want to speculate kind of on that. I mean, you do hear from time to time kind of commentators saying, well, both of those players are currently doing pretty well, so there was no real need to merge. I'll just let that stand as its own statement without commenting on whether I agree kind of on that or not. I mean, I think what we see in terms of the Asian players, I mean, if you look at China, for example, I mean, of course, it is a major impact if if a country the size of China makes a strategic plan and says we want to be leading in this particular area in the next 5 years, or make it a goal of one of the 5-year plans. And so we do see in areas where the Chinese government basically decides that they want to become world leading. You see massive changes, massive growth of the companies. Companies are simply put together. It seems like merger control is basically suspended in some of these cases because it is simply a political decision that these deals go ahead. And so I think we do see massive scaling up of many of the Asian players, and to what extent they are then necessarily successful when they try to enter other markets such as Europe or the US, is sometimes a question mark. And I mean, what we're seeing at the moment, certainly on the energy side of things, is that the Chinese market has become so extremely competitive that the local players struggle, and so there have even been press reports that there are essentially agreements to make sure that there is, let's say, market stability. I think it's often referred to, which is just basically another name for saying we are not going to undercut each other on prices and lead to a downward death spiral. And I mean, we've seen that on the EV side. We've seen that in solar, and I've also seen press reports in relation to other sectors. So I mean, that seems to be a fairly common kind of occurrence. But of course, that also explains why, if you are not able to succeed, at least commercially, in your own home market, then you're going to think about going elsewhere. And that's why we see, certainly in some of the sectors that also Siemens Energy is active in, increasing interest by Chinese players. And I mean, let's face it, if the customers have another competitor who they can use to lower the price of their existing suppliers, then they won't be too unhappy about that either.
We heard caricaturized and kind of apocalyptic stories about telecommunication industry, that 3G was kind of European, Euro-centered European companies were the leaders shaping the global technological agenda. 4G, it was kind of parity. With 5G, we are barely there. We are still okay, kind of. But with 6G, it will be not marginal, but by far not the kind of Champions League zone, so to say, for Europe. So the leadership, the global leadership is moving. Whether it is caricature or maybe there is some part of it which are less scaremongering but more realistic. Leaving aside, but speaking of the formula itself, do you see something happening, something of this kind, some shifts happening towards the East globally, strategically in the 5, 10, 15 years perspective in energy and maybe in mobility, as you said, Siemens are operating?
So, I mean, I think the telecommunication side is quite interesting because I mean we've gone in Europe, I think, from a situation where the competition authorities had said fairly clearly that kind of anything more concentrated than 5 to 4 was likely to be an issue. Then more recently we've seen kind of a case in the UK. With behavioral commitments and investments, kind of proposals, which give some deal makers, I think, hope that maybe telecommunications could now be a segment where mergers are possible, which may not have been possible previously. Again, against the background of something like the Draghi report, and I think the Draghi report, if I recall correctly, focuses quite heavily on telecommunications and says this is a classic example of a case or of a segment which needs consolidation. In order to do that. I mean, in terms of the kind of success of European companies, kind of going, for example, to Asia. I mean, China, as you know, is a separate kind of issue, just on the basis that that market, can in many cases be basically closed, and so there is no reciprocity in that sense. So I mean, I think that can be an issue. I mean, in terms of, and of course, Asia is not just China. There are many other, kind of major jurisdictions where it is very possible and, also very realistic to do very good business. And as I say, we at Siemens Energy have, a third of our turnover roughly in Asia. So there are very important kind of countries there outside of China where we do business, and APAC is a major focus for us. So I think for any major company such as ourselves, we have to be able to do successful business all over the world, which we do, and so as long as you can ensure that, then hopefully your long-term strategic future is secure.
And that's, I wanted to ask you more specifically on the relationship between competition policy and industrial policy. It's like the consensus is overlapping consensus is that they are not antagonists.
Mm-hmm.
Now the next question for the European Union is that the fact that we agree that probably they have to be somehow coordinated in one way or another. It doesn't mean that we know how to do it, because we've been nurturing our technological and industrial development based rather on the right-wing kind of perception or kind of hands-off approach, relying on the invisible hand more than on the kind of strategic planning, so to say. And you can talk about, there is no in real life there is no hands-off approach, and in real life there is no perfect planning where and planning can be mutated into very dystopian situation kind of outcomes. But we know that planning do also play a greater role of states. Sometimes help businesses. We see examples. So I wonder, how would you propose to the Commission maybe, or to some largest member states, to re-evaluate its perception of the relationship between competition and industrial policy. Not only agreeing, okay, we have to synchronize them somehow, but more specifically, what should we learn from the jurisdictions which are ideologically, which appear to be ideologically not compatible, not perfectly suitable to the liberal democratic ethos which navigated us for decades.
Mm. So I think this is a quite a difficult quite a difficult question to answer. I mean, I think there is an increasing realization in Europe that for many years, competition enforcers stayed very much in their lane, and they looked at competition and the broader aspects of kind of resilience and industrial policy were very much seen as, let's say, not part of the competition law lane, and therefore, something to be looked at as something that didn't really play a role. And I think, post COVID, post the war in Ukraine, post all of the other kind of energy crises that we've seen as a result, I think that approach has simply been recognized to have fallen short. And so I think what you have to do, and what the European Union clearly has recognized, is that indeed, I've heard European Commission officials say something along these lines as well. And I think you can see it also in the Teresa Ribera speech that I quoted a few minutes ago. There is a realization that we have to match up these two things. Competition law, industrial policy. They all need to lead to a situation where we create a resilient, competitive, consumer-friendly Europe. That's what everyone wants. And I think this narrow, maybe overly narrow focus on competition is something that doesn't serve us well in this very complex, kind of global world that we find ourselves in, full of, very significant risks. It's always very easy to say, what I've just said. We have to marry up and make consistent kind of competition law and industrial policy. I think what it means in practice is that you do things that maybe previously you wouldn't have done. So you do take more seriously when a company says, look, there is a risk in this market for low-cost Asian suppliers to enter, and what is that going to do to our resilience, to our capability to deal with crises, etc. I mean, that 5 years ago probably, or pre-COVID, you would have not come very far if you had made that kind of argument to the European Commission. And look at Siemens Alstom, which is in a sense a good example of that. And so I think there is no particular magic to it. I think it is just a situation where you have to broaden the analysis. You have to broaden the lane of competition and say, look, competition is one important consideration, but there are also maybe other important considerations. Now, for us or for me at least, as a kind of specialist competition lawyer, of course, the way in which competition law was looked at also historically, there was always a movement away. I mean, if you look at the UK, for example, there was a movement away from, let's say, the political interference, and the kind of industrial policy side of things was always, that's political interference. We don't want that. We want to focus on true competition. That's what competition authorities were supposed to look at. And I think that's just a view which is outdated now. That doesn't mean that we all have to turn into Lina Khan, or we have to try to solve all the world's problems with competition law. I don't think you can do that. But I think these topics of resilience and competitiveness, I think competitiveness is really the new buzzword, because that tries to combine the competition and the industrial policy side of things by saying, we are not interested necessarily in pure competition. We are interested in competitiveness, which also bears in mind resilience and all the other kind of strategic topics that need to come together, so that we can make sure that Europe is in the best possible position to to be a truly competitive, continent where, we can still make sure that if someone, flips the kill switch, that we still have other alternatives and that we are not entirely dependent on, countries that may not be friendly to us in the long term.
But then we hear not a counter arguments, but somehow an attempt to, or don't want to judge anybody, but some people say, well, until Europe creates genuinely single market, until it will start singing in single voice, in unison, until the largest member states will not be tailoring their industries and their markets, but will be focused on pan-European agenda, there is no point in even attempting to become a global stakeholder in various markets. Do you think it's just an attempt to find a legitimate until we get a financial union, a taxation policy? Do you think it's setting up these unrealistic targets is just another way to somehow to pause the enthusiasm, or these are realistic and unavoidable components of building up the European capacity?
I mean, I think that I think whether or not we have, financial union or tax union, Europe has to make sure that it can continue to thrive in the, everyone is looking out for themselves. All the major trading blocs are focused on their own success. And somehow in Europe also, historically, we've had a slightly different view. I think if you look at it cynically, you could say, the Europeans were always very concerned with playing by all the rules. We wanted to be non-discriminatory. We didn't want to kick anyone out. Whereas the US and China and Asia to a lesser extent, kind of always focused on themselves and always unabashedly said, obviously we are currently seeing maybe an extreme version of America first, but the US always considered what was beneficial to it. And if it was beneficial to support Europe, for example, on the security side of things, then they would do that. If it was, good diplomatically to, support regimes around the world, then they would do that. And, currently the view is a different one. But, I think we in Europe have to learn that, a key part of us remaining competitive and indeed, remaining successful is that we learn to not be embarrassed by putting ourselves first. And that doesn't mean that we have to do everyone else down, but I think it does mean that, we have to take care of ourselves. And, by being the only one who plays fair, you're going to be the one who's going to be left behind. And so I think as a continent, I don't think we can make the full completion of the single market a precondition to us now starting to look after ourselves. And I mean, if you look at things like the public procurement review, which is being worked on at the moment, I mean, we will probably see some requirements to buy European, the kind of thing that 5 years ago would have been unthinkable that Europe would have put something like that in place. I think now is realistic because people have realized, look, if we don't, everyone else is doing this, and therefore, we are going to be badly left behind if we do not do the same. You can have a philosophical debate as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think, we are faced with such an uncertain world with so many risks that, we don't really have the luxury of, sitting in our ivory tower and saying, we want to be non-discriminatory. I mean, I think, if it comes to our resilience and, that we continue to succeed, then, we have to look after number one, just like everyone else is doing.
And this leads me perfectly to the question on EU foreign subsidies regulation. How do you evaluate this and similar regulatory initiatives, both in terms of their objectives, but also in terms of the mechanics?
So I have a very differentiated view, I would say, between kind of the objectives and the mechanics. We as a company kind of identified this topic fairly early on already in the legislative process. We could see that this was something which was going to affect us. We, I think, in line with many other companies, absolutely support the concept of the foreign subsidies regulation. We think it is very important, and we've always advocated for a level playing field in Europe. And as I've said on multiple occasions during this call, we see in the energy space that if Chinese companies, let's say, instructed to do so by the government, take a strategic view that they want to enter particular markets, then they will do that, and they will take a very specific strategic view on doing that. And so the foreign subsidies regulation aims to create that level playing field, and we absolutely support that. On the mechanics, we were heavily involved to provide feedback to the European Commission, in particular when the draft implementing regulation came out, because it was at the time completely unmanageable what the European Commission was expecting us to do. The foreign financial contributions that we have to provide. I mean, in the initial proposal, we would have had to do a line-by-line kind of listing up of all of these foreign financial contributions. It would have been impossible to manage, not only for a large company such as ourselves, but in particular for the many small and medium-sized enterprises that may also have been affected by the foreign subsidies regulation. But interestingly, during the legislative process, in fact, many European governments were giving the European Commission the same feedback. And so this was one of the maybe quite rare occasions when national governments and the business community were telling the European Commission, look, you have gone way too far in your requirements here. And it was reduced down to something which was much more manageable. I mean, these days you have to provide a list of foreign financial contributions only in a summary form. You can provide the figures in ranges, and so it has become much more manageable. I mean, on the operational side of things, the European Commission, I can't think of any other regulatory instrument, at least that I'm familiar with, where the European Commission has, in a short period of time, created such an enforcement record. I mean, we had the first couple of public procurement cases where the Chinese bidders withdrew because they didn't want to deal with the in-depth investigations. Then we even had a dawn raid in relation to a investigation against Nuctec, which is a Chinese security provider of scanning equipment at airports. And I mean, I was certainly very surprised that the European Commission went quite that far. They have opened up some ex officio investigations. We've seen a commitments decision, even though it's not referred to as that, on the M&A side. So I think the European Commission really has come out of the blocks, if I can mix my metaphors, like a steam train, and really is absolutely determined to make the most of this new instrument. I think for many companies, the primary interest will be to see what does the European Commission make out of it. There is some anecdotal evidence to suggest that potentially Chinese companies might be thinking twice before applying for public procurement projects, just because they know that there is this FSR topic, and how are they going to deal with it. But I mean, one of the ex officio investigations is in relation to Chinese wind turbine manufacturers. That is, of course, a topic which is of interest to us, and so we look at that with great interest. But so I think we support the concept. We now also think it is manageable in terms of process, even though it is still a lot of work. I mean, I dedicate quite a bit of my time to dealing with the various different filings that we make, but certainly something that we think can have a positive outcome. And at the end of the day, we all want a level playing field. No one wants to exclude anyone from the European market, but what we do want is to be able to compete against our competitors on this level playing field. That's very important. And if the FSR can help us to achieve that, then we would certainly welcome that.
On the public procurement side, you have this privilege as being really a multinational organization to take part in public procurement procedures globally. So
Hmm.
you definitely sense which system is better calibrated and also where you see this kind of hidden or maybe explicit even preference to the local, to the domestic, being given to the domestic companies. Do you think that we've been running behind by being naively uh, open to all global players, often to the detriment of the European companies? Can we say it, or it is rather something which can be? You need high level of imagination to make such state and courage to make this statement.
I mean, certainly, I think that there would be you could find lots of people who would have that view. I mean, I think, uh, I mean, for in my personal view, um, I mean, I think we're getting to a point where uh, you know many jurisdictions. I mean, if you look at the wind sector, for example, whenever there is a major project in a particular country, then that country is going to want local content, and so these local content requirements. If you were bidding on major wind projects all over the world, you would basically be required to build a factory in every country where you're active because of this local content requirement. And traditionally, Europe, in the spirit of fair play that I was mentioning earlier, has been very much less active on that kind of local content side of things. Whereas, in Asia, it was always a very explicit requirement. If you want to, build this big offshore wind park, then we expect the blade factory, to be here in our country. Otherwise, forget about winning this tender. And so, at a certain point, of course, then a company also has to consider, is this something that we are willing to do? You then might even have a competition issue if you think about, maybe we need to team up with our competitors to, deal with something like this. So I think, Europe is now maybe slowly catching up and, also seeing the benefits of, maybe insisting on, local content requirements. All I can say from a business perspective is that if everyone is imposing local content requirements, you're going to make it much more difficult for companies, and you are likely to have a less competitive position rather than a more competitive position, because you are not going to get three major wind turbine manufacturers all building a factory in a particular country on the off chance that they will win a particular project there. I mean, that's just not realistic. So I think that would be my view in relation to that issue.
One of the last questions. We have the new commissioner, but also new DG comp forthcoming at the moment when we record the interview, at least. How important these changes historically are? What is the role of personality in driving, in piloting such large, such impactful parts of the even broader regulatory authorities, the European Commission? Do you expect some significant changes also, or these should be incremental contribution towards what is going on currently?
I mean, I think that if you look at someone like a competition commissioner, of course, they stamp their own authority on their portfolio. Indeed, if you compare the portfolios of Margrethe Vestager and now Teresa Ribera, they are quite different. Margrethe Vestager, in addition to being the competition commissioner, had the digital portfolio, which is why we saw all the cases. And we also had the regulatory initiatives in relation to DMA, DSA, etc. Whereas Teresa Ribera comes in much more from an environmental background. My understanding is that she was a minister in Spain in charge of essentially the clean and just transition, pretty much the same as she is kind of now at European level. Whereas in fact, when I first looked at her portfolio, I wondered, how she was going to get the time to deal with any competition, topics, frankly. So, I think at the end of the day, any competition commissioner will have their own, kind of topics that they are keen on dealing with. Will we see the European Commission pick up major cases on, let's say, this whole interplay between antitrust and sustainability? If you look at the profile of the commissioner, you might say yes. But if I look at, let's say, the way that this topic is being discussed in the competition law community, this was a very hot issue a couple of years ago, but it has become, I think, less of an issue these days. So I'm not entirely sure. We do still see in some of the cartel cases, for example, that there is always a line in the press release talking about the environmental impact. We saw that on the emissions cartel case a few years ago. I think we've seen it again on the recycling of end-of-life vehicles, which was just finished a few weeks ago. But as with any authority, the leadership of the authority is usually quite far away from the cases. It works a bit differently in the EU than it does in the US and in other jurisdictions. But I think, of course, we monitor very closely. I mean, I try to read all of Teresa Ribera's speeches, for example, just to get a sense as to what's hot and what's going on. I try to do the same for the US authorities and some of the other key authorities also. So yes, of course, we do look at that, but at the end of the day, it is the case teams, at the working level who are doing the work, and so yes, the competition commissioner will set the overall direction, and we monitor that quite closely to make sure that we're aware, because of course one of the things that I spend and me and my colleagues spend a lot of time doing is simply monitoring what's going on, and one of the best ways of doing that is to follow what are the agency heads saying, what are they doing, what kind of cases are they picking up. There are annual plans, there are annual reports, all of these things are interesting sources for us to see, where are the trends, where are the risks. I mean, something that was not much of a big deal 10 years ago, the whole HR and antitrust topic, no poaching, wage fixing, information exchange on the HR side is a massive priority these days. And when I started working on this topic in 2014, you couldn't really get HR to focus on it because they basically considered that antitrust didn't apply to them. Whereas these days, you've got law firms sending out newsletters listing all of the investigations. I mean, we had a recent fine in the UK, for example, various other authorities having investigations. So things change, and so we also have to make sure that we are aware of that we are monitoring that, and that we implement risk mitigation measures when we do see that there are new competition and other regulatory risks coming up.
Amazing. Thank you very much for highlighting this aspect of in-house competition law team. You mentioned also green, clean, just transition. So I wanted to pair it to the previous topic which we've been looking at. This obviously is essential for all of us: clean and fresh air, water, and environment more generally. We live and breathe there, so we're talking about everyone's well-being. It goes without saying, self-evident, but it's also expensive. So I wonder how big this challenge, this aporia, this conundrum is, this clash is, where you comply with high standards while others just not circumvent, they dump actually by decreasing their standards or not complying with their standards, and thus getting competitive advantage with those who comply. Is it a systemic issue, or it's rather something not so important?
I mean, I think it is an important issue because I think if you look at a regulatory instrument like CBAM, for example, that is the carbon border adjustment mechanism that is precisely intended to, again, level the playing field and to make sure that if there are high European standards on the environmental side, for example, that you are not undercut by producers in other countries who are not complying with those standards, or maybe complying with significantly lesser standards. And so the carbon border adjustment mechanism basically says, look, we are going to try to again, level the playing field between, somebody who might be subject to much lesser environmental regulations than the companies in Europe. And so I think, it is a major issue. I think I would consider it to be, systemic. I'm not, kind of accusing anyone of, specifically, using the differences in standards to gain a competitive advantage. I mean, of course, if you are, if you only look at something like energy costs, for example, anyone who is manufacturing in the US purely on energy costs has a massive advantage over any European player, because energy costs in the US are a fraction of what they are in Europe. That is a fact. And of course, if you are a company and you are thinking about, where am I going to put my next factory, those are the kind of considerations that you are going to look at. So yes, when a company is considering where to invest, all of these matters will play a role. But I think we are seeing in Europe also that there are some activities on the regulatory side, such as CBAM, to try to let's say, lessen the differences and the distortions that can occur if you have widely varying standards in different parts of the world.
Energy costs and AI. Does it also mean that we are less competitive on this side, for that Europe is less competitive on this side of AI as well, because it requires so much energy, or it's incremental also?
Yeah, it was interesting to monitor the stock market after the DeepSeek topic came up, because suddenly everyone was not so sure whether this standard narrative that AI was very data hungry, whether that was actually correct or not. And indeed, there was also a course correction for the energy companies, because suddenly it wasn't quite as clear whether as many data centers would be needed as people had thought originally. But of course, I think it's now. I haven't monitored the topic in detail, but I understand that there is some doubt as to kind of how cheap DeepSeek actually did manage to develop its model. And so I think the general understanding still is that AI is very data hungry, and of course that would then put European players, if you just looked at that aspect, kind of at a disadvantage. But I think honestly that energy costs is one of many factors which will determine the success or failure of AI players. One would hope that let's say the quality of the model is going to be the main kind of consideration, and that energy costs would not be that little thing that would tip a particular company into either success or failure. But that's just my personal view.
Let me finish with inviting you, Gordon, to provide some sincere advice to students who are doing law degree, and maybe there are some tips which could help them to prepare better for their career.
So I hesitate to say kind of when I did my degrees, it was back in the 1990s. So that will you'll be able to work out my age on that basis. I studied in Exeter from 1992 to 2002, and I did 3 degrees at the time. I did an LLB Euro with German. I did the Masters in European Legal Studies, and then I did a PhD. And looking back now, I have figured out that I was very inefficient when I was, in particular, in the first kind of few years. I remember spending many hours in the law library, kind of copying out the head notes of cases that we were supposed to read. So you had the case note, and I would copy that into my file, and I had big files with all these case notes, and I was spending a lot of time doing that. And then when it came to revision time, I had massive files full of documents, which I then had to try to learn. And there were other people who had managed to distill that information in a much more efficient kind of way. And so I think what I came to appreciate, maybe a bit too late, was that it's not just about kind of the amount of work that you do, but also that you do it in a manner which is much more efficient. Now, clearly these days with AI, if I'd had co-pilot to do me, kind of brief summaries of cases and that kind of thing. I don't even know how that works in university these days. But you're talking in my case, kind of 30 years ago. So it was a different time. But I did not work very efficiently, and that then also meant that I was sometimes quite unhappy with my marks, because I felt that my marks didn't necessarily. I mean, I got good marks, but sometimes with kind of essays and projects and things, I didn't really get the marks that I felt that the work that I put in deserved. And when you are working in house, the main thing that you have to do is to transport the information that you are providing to the business colleagues in a snappy, efficient way. That's what it's all about. Of course, it has to be correct, but that's key. And so the quicker you learn how to take in, distill information and work efficiently, kind of the better it is. The other very basic thing that I did, and which I recommend to all of the students, is to really make sure when they are doing their exams that they have a system. I mean, I had a system where I took the amount of points in the exam, I divided it by the amount of minutes, and I therefore wrote down, the first thing I did in an exam was to say, okay, question one, 40 marks out of 100, therefore I can dedicate 40% of my time. This is a 3-hour exam, therefore I have to be finished by X time. And I stuck to that rigorously. So I never ran out of time when it came to exams. I never left out the last question because I'd run out of time. And I think it is a cardinal sin if you are not answering questions because you've run out of time, because you are never going to get the amount of points, in the last page that you've written, of the 12 that you might have written, than you would have received for at least a basic answer to the last question that you ultimately didn't do. So this whole time management thing is something, and I mean, I see this at school as well. I mean, my 9-year-old came home from school the other day and told me, she had a test and she answered 4 questions out of 5, and I said to her, well, that's where you've already gone wrong. I mean, that already means that you can't get the top mark because you haven't answered one question. And it may sound basic, it may sound, in a sense silly, but the amount of times that I see that people are throwing away marks because they simply don't have the time management is just not. It just doesn't make any sense. So those would be kind of the 2 things: work effectively and try to make sure that you spend an appropriate amount of time on each question in an exam. That will hopefully set you up, if you've done your revision correctly, to get the mark that you also deserve.
Absolutely. Goran, Christian, thank you very much indeed for this fascinating conversation. It's really a pleasure.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Oles. It's a pleasure as all mine.